Welcome back, everyone, to this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to begin our discussion of Plato's Apology. And the purpose of this video is going to be to talk about the context of this dialogue a little bit, how it's related to the Euthyphro, and also set the stage for what's to come. So let's remember what has just happened in the previous dialogue, the Euthyphro, from a narrative perspective. Socrates met Euthyphro outside the courthouse. They both had business at court at a later point in time. And where we pick up with from the story in the Apology is now we see Socrates actually at trial, actually defending himself at court. And of course, as I've already told you, this is a trial which ultimately did lead to his death, and in some sense, as we're going to see in the Apology, a death which was caused by his fundamental and absolute commitment to philosophy. Now, what I want to do here to set the stage for you is to talk a little bit about the approach that Socrates is taking to his own defense, as well as the charges he's going to face. Okay, so there's a few sort of preliminary points that we should get out of the way. First, you might see the title Plato's Apology as a very weird title, because as you continue to read the Apology, which we're going to do this week and then also next week as well, as you read the Apology, one thing you're going to find, in fact, are very few apologies from Socrates. In fact, at no point does he ever apologize in the normal sense of the word to the jury. So why is this called an apology? Well, it's called apology in a different sense of the term, right? There's another sense of apology which means a defense. So, for instance, you might have heard the phrase a Christian apologist. Okay, so what does a Christian apologist do? A Christian apologist does not apologize for their faith. They don't say, oh, I'm sorry for believing this thing, or, it's obviously bogus. How could I believe this? No, they don't apologize. A Christian apologist engages in the work of defending the faith, defending the existence of God, defending the accounts of the miracles that are in the Bible, etc., etc. Right, so that's the sense in which the word apology is used here. What you find in the Apology is Socrates' defense of himself at trial against the charges that are brought by his accusers. Now, what were these charges? Well, we're going to talk about this in more detail later, but the official charges were basically that Socrates didn't believe in the gods of the city, he invented new gods, and this connects it with the Euthyphro because the charge is basically the charge of impiety, and also a very important charge of corrupting the youth. A charge which Socrates is going to take very seriously because of what he thinks, the sort of knowledge he thinks one would have to be able to claim that they know someone is corrupting the youth. In any case, those are the two official charges he's facing, and the requested punishment for these charges was death. Now, I should also say that there is debate about this, but some scholars think that the real reason Socrates is brought to trial and given such a harsh proposed penalty had less to do with those actual charges themselves, but actually with some political reasons. So we need to understand some basic background historical points that lead up to the Apology. First thing you need to know is that from 431 to 404 BCE, Athens and Sparta were engaged in a war. It's called the Peloponnesian War. Now, Athens is a city where Socrates and Plato live, and ultimately Athens surrendered to Sparta in 404. So what happens after this? Well, once Athens surrenders, an oligarchy of tyrants known as the 30, these 30 tyrants come to power. And Athens had previously been a democracy. The 30 replaces the Athenian democracy with this sort of reign of terror, as two commentators, Brickhouse and Smith, described it. Now, this reign of terror, as reigns of terror generally do, didn't last very long. It only lasted 1 year. Eventually there was a rebellion, and many members of the city rose up and retook Athens. Importantly, among these was Anytus, who you might recall from our discussion of the Euthyphro, was one of Socrates' accusers. It's also very important to know that while many people during the reign of the 30 left or were exiled, right, they just said, I've had enough of this, or they were literally kicked out of the city, Socrates remained behind. So the first thing you have to think about is that what sort of impression might that give? Many people left the city, Socrates didn't. There may have been some suspicion he actually supported the 30. And this suspicion was given some further substantiation by the fact that Socrates, as we've already discussed, I've already hinted for you, Socrates was skeptical about and really a critic of democracy. And so these two facts together gave many the impression that he may have supported the 30. Now you might ask, well, okay, if the reason they really wanted to bring him to trial was because he had supported this previous regime and was against the Athenian democracy, well, why didn't they just say so? Why didn't they make those the official charges? The reasoning was that there was a general amnesty passed after the fall of the 30. So basically the idea was anyone who had previously supported the 30, once they fell in the rebellion, there was a general amnesty. No one was going to be charged for those political reasons. So if you previously supported that regime, nothing was going to happen to you. And you can imagine why they would pass this, right? If you want to bring society back together, you don't want to start criticizing many of your fellow citizens who might have political disagreements about their previous support for the regime. So because of that, even if they had wanted to bring Socrates specifically on those charges, they weren't allowed to by law. So they had to find some other reason to bring him to court. Now, another preliminary point here is we should say a few things about the Athenian legal process so you can get in your mind sort of the situation and context that we're talking about. So Socrates' trial actually takes place in 399, so that's 4 years after Athens is retaken. It took place in front of 500 jurors and was expected to be completed in 1 day. So what you're imagining here is first, Socrates' accusers get up, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, they make their case. Then Socrates gets up all by himself and he provides a defense in front of these 500 jurors. Oops. So, who were, and let me put it this way, there's a few other points about the legal process to understand. Now, one thing to think about, in criminal trials in our legal system, let's say you're charged with a crime. Who is it that's technically charging you with that crime? Let's say you steal from somebody. Is it the person that you stole from who's actually bringing those charges against you? Well, technically, no. It's actually the state. It's actually the government. Right? We have a system where we sort of outsource criminal justice to the state, so we don't have conflicts among specific individual citizens. But in Athens, it wasn't like this. The government itself was not bringing these charges. His fellow citizens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, his three accusers, were themselves bringing a case to court, and they were responsible for making the case against Socrates. Another difference is that both the accusers and the defendant were not allowed to have legal representation. You had to make the case yourself. Now, it was often common for people to hire speechwriters to make their case sound better, but notably, Socrates didn't use this. It was offered to him, but he said, I'm not going to take that service. I'm just going to let my words speak for themselves. And perhaps most notably, there was no jury selection process. So who were these 500 jurors? They were just his peers, citizens of Athens. They served voluntarily, but there was no jury selection process. In our criminal justice system, there's a process by which each side, the prosecution and the defense, they get to object to certain jurors. They say, well, I think this juror will be biased against my client, will be biased against my case. So they have the opportunity to say, no, we're not going to have that juror. There's this jury selection process. The idea, ideally at least, is to get a jury that's not biased either way, that's neutral and impartial. Does that always happen in practice? Well, no. Oftentimes the jury selection process is used specifically to bias the jury in favor of your case. But at least ideally that's the idea. But that wasn't even available here. So why this matters is that you have to think about things from Socrates' point of view. 500 of his fellow citizens are going to render a verdict on whether he should live or die. There was no jury selection process to weed out any of those individuals who might be biased against him. And also remember the sort of activity that Socrates had been engaging in. We talked about how it was very common for him to be in the agora, the Athenian marketplace. engaging people in philosophical discussion. And of course, he often got the upper hand in those philosophical discussions. We saw that last time, how in his discussion with Euthyphro, he shot down all three of Euthyphro's definitions. Euthyphro never really had any good response. And this was quite a common thing. So you have a jury of 500 of Socrates' peers, some of whom might not be so happy with Socrates because of the ways he might have subjected them to public embarrassment for the way he questioned them publicly. And these are the people deciding whether he's going to live or die. Okay. Now, with those points in mind, let's go to Socrates' opening remarks, because they seem somewhat straightforward, but there's a lot of important issues that are embedded here. So the first thing is, when Socrates begins to speak, his accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, have already gotten up and made their case, and now it's Socrates' turn. And he starts off by saying that many of the things they said were false, but he says, among their many falsehoods, however, one especially amazed me, that you must be careful not to be deceived by me, since I'm a dangerously clever speaker. So Socrates says, one of the things they told you is you got to be cautious around Socrates. He's a very clever speaker. Don't fall for his traps. And Socrates rejects this. He says, I'm not a clever speaker at all. He says, unless, of course, the one they call clever is the one who tells the truth. If that's what they mean, I'd agree I'm an orator, although not one of their sort. Now, this sentence is very important because it establishes a theme we're going to be picking up on later on. He draws a distinction between someone who's an orator and someone who tells the truth. Okay, now what's an orator? An orator is someone who makes speeches, who's a master of rhetoric, if they're a good orator, and can speak in a very persuasive manner. Someone who tells the truth, at least in Socrates' sort of conception of it, just says, here are the facts. Someone who speaks in a plain-spoken manner and is only concerned about establishing what is actually the case. So an orator might say something that sounds good, but whether it's true or false, well, that's an entirely different matter. So right from the beginning, you can see Socrates expressing this commitment to the truth itself and saying, I'm not here to engage in persuasive rhetoric. I'm not here to employ any logical fallacies or tricks. I'm just here to lay out the truth as I see it. Now, whether you think that's actually the case, well, you can be the judge as you continue to read the Apology. But Socrates does say this is his fundamental commitment, and this idea is going to come up in very important ways as we continue to read. Now, here's another statement which really is worth thinking about seriously. He also says instead, I'm not going to use fine language. He says instead, what you hear will be spoken extemporaneously, and whatever words come to mind. So it's not going to be a polished speech. And let none of you expect me to do otherwise, for I put my trust in the justice of what I say. Now let's linger on that for a moment. And I want you to think about this. Would you want, let's say you were on trial for your life. You had, let's say, murder charges brought up against you. Would you want Socrates to be your lawyer? Put aside for the moment the question of whether you're guilty or innocent. Just ask yourself from a purely self-interested point of view. Would you want Socrates to be your lawyer? So imagine this. You've been charged with a crime. You're meeting with your lawyer for the first time. It's Socrates. He comes in and he says, this is going to be our strategy. I know a lot of people might want to use, persuasive rhetoric and, appeals to emotion that are really going to get the jury to feel sympathy with your case, but I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, I'm just going to put my trust in the justice of what I say. I'm going to lay it all out there, and we'll put the facts out there, and we'll just trust that the jury will make the right decision. Well, whether you were guilty of the crime or innocent, I submit that you might be feeling somewhat nervous at that point. Because in fact, that is not necessarily the best way to win a criminal case. It would be nice if we lived in a world where we could always trust that other people would dispassionately and rationally evaluate the evidence and make a decision on that basis. But human beings are often under the sway of their emotions, their passions, their biases. And so if Socrates came to me and said, look, we're just going to put the trust in the justice of what I say, lay the truth out there and trust the jury, I would be feeling pretty nervous. And so it's notable that this is in fact the attitude that Socrates takes toward his own case where his own life is at stake. And this brings up a point that we'll hit later on in the Apology. To what extent is Socrates showing much concern for his own life? And should Socrates show more concern? If he's not so concerned with whether he lives or dies, but only telling the truth, why is that? What is the justification for that? Okay, so we'll get into those questions more later on, but it's notable that this comes up at this point. Alright, now, with those initial comments in place, let's take a specific look at the actual accusations that Socrates faces. Now, there's really two sets of accusations. I already told you that the official accusations that Socrates is facing is that of corrupting the youth and impiety, not acknowledging the gods of the city. But there's also this other set of accusations, which are not the ones he's actually facing at court, which he actually spends more time refuting. And we'll call these the old accusations. Well, what are these? So here's how Socrates described it. He says, well, look, many people have been accusing me in front of you for very many years. I fear more than Anytus and the rest. They got hold of you from childhood and persuaded you with their accusations against me. So he says, first, I have a certain reputation in the city, and it's a bad reputation, because for many years people have been spreading falsehoods about me. If we go down, he continues on, he says, moreover, those accusers are numerous and have been accusing me for a long time. They also spoke to you at the age when you would most readily believe them, when some of you were children or young boys. So not only have the people in the jury heard these accusations that led to Socrates having this bad reputation in the city, but also they've been hearing them for a long time, since they were children. And you might ask, well, why is Socrates worried about this? I mean, the official charges against him are not based on this, right? They're impiety and corrupting the youth. But remember, we have a jury of his peers who voluntarily serve, for which there's no jury selection process. If you were in that situation, the first thing you might want to do is say, well, I've got to do some work to undo some of the prejudice against me. I've got to do some work to show that the preconceptions the jury might have about me are unfounded. And so the first thing he says, he's actually going to attack these old accusations first. He's going to try to right the wrong of this bad reputation that he has in the city. So what are these old accusations? These old accusations that have built up this reputation against him? He focuses on two things. So he says these accusations are that Socrates commits injustice and is a busybody, in that, one, he investigates the things beneath the earth and in the heavens, and we're going to call this the charge of natural philosophy. And two, he makes the weaker argument the stronger and teaches these things to others, and we're going to call that the charge of sophistry. So I'm going to have much more to say in this video and in the next video about sophistry, but I'll begin by saying a few things about this charge of natural philosophy. So first, what is a natural philosopher? Well, the easiest way to explain it is a natural philosopher is what we would today call a scientist. As one commentator described, natural philosophers look for the causes of things in physical processes, and is someone who accordingly denied the truth of the traditional stories about the gods. So the traditional stories about the gods in the Greek mythology had the gods responsible for many natural phenomena. But a natural philosopher says, well, let's look for the physical causes of things. The natural philosopher engages in what we would today call science. And we can see Miletus specifically making, in fact, later on in the Apology, making this charge against Socrates when he says, "Know by Zeus, gentlemen of the jury, he doesn't acknowledge that the sun and moon are gods, since he says the sun's a stone and the moon earth." Okay, now what is this a reference to? This is a reference to another philosopher of the time, who was named Anaxagoras, who did believe these things. Instead of saying the sun and moon were gods, he said the sun is a stone and moon is earth, and for his trouble he was banished from the city. So according to this accusation, this sort of reputation that Socrates has, he's like Anaxagoras. He's one of these natural philosophers. Now, the first thing we're going to see is that Socrates outrightly rejects this, right? And he says here, not that I mean to disparage this knowledge, right? He doesn't have anything against natural philosophy, but he says he himself has nothing to do with it. It's not really a concern of his. In fact, as we're going to see, his concern is really with moral philosophy. For Socrates, the really important questions are, how should we live our lives? What's important in a human life? How do we live a flourishing human life? And in the way Socrates puts it, how do we care for the soul? But of course, he needs an explanation of where this reputation came from. Now, in part, I think his reputation came from the fact that he did engage in this philosophical questioning in public. He was seen as very different, very iconoclastic. He was sort of grouped together in a group of radical intellectuals who thought very differently from the accepted ways. And that's true, right? If you have someone like Socrates going around questioning commonly held beliefs, right, engaging in philosophical dialogue with people, forcing them to examine their beliefs, he might seem similar to the natural philosophers who went around questioning the traditional religious stories. And this reputation was solidified also by a comedic play by the playwright Aristophanes called The Clouds, in which one of the scenes, well actually many of the scenes, but one scene in particular is mentioned in the Apology, featured Socrates. So here's an excerpt from that play. So we see Socrates and Strepsiades, and they're having this discussion. So and where it takes place is in this picture, as this picture shows. Socrates is sort of suspended in this weird basket high above the ground, near the clouds, and Strepsiades is near the ground. So Socrates loftily says, "Mortal, what do you want with me?" Strepsiades, "First, what are you doing up there? Tell me, I beseech you." "I'm traversing the air and contemplating the sun." "Thus 'tis not on the solid ground, but from the height of this basket that you slight the gods, if indeed." What does Socrates say? "I have to suspend my brain and mingle the subtle essence of my mind with this air, which is of the like nature, in order to clearly penetrate the things of heaven. I should have discovered nothing had I remained on the ground to consider from below things that are above. For the earth by its force attracts the sap of the mind itself. It is just the same with the watercress." So Socrates here is portrayed as a sort of kooky, very strange individual. It says, if I'm going to understand the heavens and the planets, my mind needs to be in the sky. I need to meld the essence of my mind with the clouds. Right? So this caricature of Socrates was put forth to mock him and portray him as someone who had very strange and odd ideas that went against traditional orthodoxy, went against traditional religious beliefs. So that's really the source of the accusation of natural philosophy. He doesn't say too much about it other than that it's really not his concern. And as we see through the rest of the speech and his writings, it's really not something he's all that concerned with. Again, his concern is moral philosophy. But what about this second charge? The accusation of sophistry. Here I think we need to do a little more work. So first, let's return to how Socrates characterizes what sophistry is. The charge is that Socrates makes the weaker argument the stronger and teaches these things to others. Okay, well let's break that down. Let's take first this idea of making the weaker argument the stronger. Alright, now, what does that mean? How can you make a weaker argument a stronger argument? Let's say you have a really bad argument for something, right? An argument that makes a bad inference, has many false premises, makes many extraordinary claims. You have a really bad argument for some conclusion. Now, what would it mean to make the argument stronger? Well, you could completely change the argument. You could replace the bad premises with true claims, but if you changed it enough, you're probably arguing for something different. So let's say you wanted to argue the same point, but you didn't want to concern yourself really with the truth of the matter. What might you do? Well, think back to that original distinction Socrates made between an orator and someone who tells the truth, between speaking persuasively and between speaking plainly and truthfully. The way to understand what it means to make the weaker argument stronger would be to dress it up rhetorically. Instead of actually strengthening the facts and the logic, how about you just strengthen the way it sounds? You make it sound better. You develop a certain way of speaking eloquently, speaking persuasively, developing an intonation in your voice, which makes the words you say sound very attractive. That would, of course, be one way to make really bad arguments stronger. And that's a nifty skill to have, because if that's the case, you don't need to convince people. You don't need to worry about what's true. You don't need to worry about doing your research or finding evidence for your claims. All you need to do is worry about how to speak well and speak persuasively. So the charge is that Socrates does this, and the charge is also that he teaches these things to others. Now, let's think about that skill for a moment, the ability to make a bad argument sound really good and persuasive. Why would that be valuable in a democracy? Remember, the 30 had just been deposed of, and the Athenian democracy was put back in place. Why would it be a worry in a democracy that there was someone going around teaching people how to do this? Well, in democracy, if your power comes from your ability to convince your fellow citizens, and if you have the ability to be convincing without actually making true, good, and sound arguments, then you'll be able to wield a lot of power in the city. You'll be able to convince a lot of people you're right, even if what you say is incorrect, even if what you say is going to cause the ruin of the community, even if what you say is going to cause us to make bad political decisions. And this is not just a concern just a concern for the Athenian democracy. This is still a concern today. In particular, in an age of social media, right? There's a sense in which the ability to talk about matters of public concern, to have a voice in the public, is wider than others. Literally anyone can get on YouTube, as I'm doing right now, and make their thoughts known. Now, in some ways, this is good. It's good that the entire ability to communicate to the public isn't held by a small portion of people. There are some advantages to that. But there are also some disadvantages. Because when you have so much information, so many people giving their thoughts, so many people giving their opinions, who often gets the most likes on YouTube? Who gets the most likes on Instagram or Facebook? Is it always the person with the most logically rational and cogent argument? Or is it the person who can speak most persuasively, who has the most attractive thumbnail on their video, who knows just the way to title their YouTube videos to get the most clicks, who knows a way to take down other people's arguments in a humorous way that attracts the attention of other people? We're dealing with this same sort of problem. It's a real problem when many people in a democracy have the ability to gain influence without actually saying what is true, or at least doing their best to say what is true. And so this was very much a concern for the people of Athens and their democracy, if we have people who can gain influence in this way. And in fact, there were people in the city who taught just this ability, and they were called sophists. That's why this is the accusation of sophistry. These people in the city taught specialized techniques of persuasion to people who wanted to gain influence in the city. In particular, if you, at the time, if you had a son who you wanted to be politically active and have political influence, many wealthy Athenians would spend a lot of money on sophists to teach their sons how to be rhetorical and persuasive so they could have successful political careers. And so this is the charge that's made against Socrates. Now, one of the things he says initially against this charge is that this is not true. One reason that we should suspect this isn't true is if you take Socrates seriously, you think he's being straightforward. At the beginning of the speech, he said he was absolutely committed to the truth and not speaking persuasively. But another piece of evidence he gives is, in fact, his own poverty. He says he's never taken a fee for any of the engagement that he's had with younger people in Athens. Remember, he was very popular with a lot of young Athenians. They liked to hang around him. They liked to see him engage in philosophical discussion. But he says, I've never taken a fee, so I don't engage in the way a sophist would, who's looking to make money. And we're going to have much more to say about why, in fact, Socrates it's not just that he isn't a sophist, he's very critical of sophistry. And some of the reasons he's so critical we can see from the following passage, where he talks about one sophist in particular. Right, so he mentions that there's someone in the audience, Callias, who had spent more money on sophists than everyone else put together. Now just take a pause for a moment and think about how sort of crazy it is that he's on trial for his life and actively insulting and calling out one of the jurors in the audience, who probably has a lot of friends in the audience as well who might be put off by this. But put that aside. He says, I happened to run into a man who spent more money on sophists than everyone else put together. Callias, right, who was a very wealthy man. He had 2 sons. He asked Callias, if your 2 sons have been colts or calves, we could engage and pay a knowledgeable supervisor, a horse breeder or farmer, who could turn them into fine and good examples of their proper virtue and excellence. So he says, look, if you had a horse and you wanted to make that the best horse possible, you would obviously hire an expert horse breeder who had specific knowledge of what is good for horses and could help that horse be the best that it can be, attain its proper excellence. But he says, well, now we're not talking about horses, we're talking about human beings. And Socrates asks, whom do you have in mind to engage as a supervisor? Who is it that has knowledge of this virtue, the virtue of human beings and of citizens? So he asks the question, who is it that is an expert in how to make human beings excellent? Who's an expert in how to make virtuous human beings? Now, this very question assumes a couple of things. First, it assumes that there is a purpose of certain sorts of human life, that there's a way to live an excellent human life, and a way not to live an excellent human life. It assumes that there's actually a way of living a human life in which you're living incorrectly. It also assumes that there can be knowledge of how to live correctly. So it's not just that, living a good human life is haphazard. Oh, just you get lucky and you have a good life, or you don't get lucky and you live a bad life. Luck plays a part. But it assumes that you can actually have knowledge of how to act correctly, to live an excellent human life, to fulfill your purpose or your virtue as a human being. And so we might wonder, well, who would it be who would have that sort of knowledge? This is exactly the sort of question that Socrates is asking. And how does Callias respond? He says, well, the person I've hired to guide my sons to make them excellent, his name is Evenus, and he's a sophist. Now, what should we think about this? Does Socrates agree that if you want to make your sons excellent, you should put them under the care of a sophist? Of course not. He thinks, in fact, as we'll see, that that's a very poor choice. And we'll have more to say about what it would mean to be an expert in human excellence. But one final comment about this is really important, because Callias says, I hired this sophist Evenus, and he charges 5 minas. Okay, so how much is 5 minas? It's a very large amount of money. It is more money than most of the jurors would make as a salary in an entire year. So we're talking about a substantial chunk of money here that's given to the sophist. And notice how Socrates responds. I thought Evenus blessedly happy if he truly did possess that expertise and taught it for so modest a fee. So Socrates says, wow, Evenus must be an amazingly happy and blessed individual if, one, he actually knows how to live an excellent human life. And he must be so generous if he taught it for almost nothing. Now, wait a minute, you might say, didn't you just say that 5 minas is a lot of money? Well, yeah, it is. But we should see this point as being somewhat ironic. He's saying, first of all, I think we can very much question whether Socrates really believes that Evenus has expertise in how to live a human life. But also the point he's making is the knowledge that Evenus claims to have about how to live an excellent, virtuous, good human life is so valuable that it pales in comparison to even that very large amount of money. This is why he says a very large amount of money, 5 minas, is really a modest fee for that kind of knowledge. And why does he say that? Because for Socrates, there is no knowledge more important. Not scientific knowledge, not practical knowledge, not mathematical knowledge. There's no knowledge more important than how to live a good, excellent human life, than how to live a virtuous human life. And in fact, what we're going to see as we move through the Apology is that this will be a fundamental theme. We'll see Socrates giving us sort of hints or guidance as to what should guide us in our lives. And that sort of knowledge, he thinks, pales in comparison really to any amount of money. Okay, so I'm going to cut this video there. I hope that was helpful, and as always, thank you for watching.